July 20th, 1969. Neil Armstrong steps onto the surface of the moon. 400 million people are watching on television. It is the greatest technological achievement in human history. The man most responsible for building the rocket that got him there is named Wernher von Braun. He is celebrated as an American hero, a genius, a visionary, NASA's golden boy. What almost nobody knew at the time, and what the US government had spent 20 years hiding, was that Wernher von Braun was a former Nazi SS officer. A man who had used concentration camp prisoners as slave labor to build weapons that killed thousands of civilians. A man whose war crime files had been deliberately destroyed by American intelligence agents so he could live freely in the United States and work for NASA. And he was not alone. Over 1,600 Nazi scientists were secretly brought to America after World War II, given new identities, new lives, government salaries, and access to America's most sensitive military programs. This is Operation Paperclip, and it was approved at the highest levels of the United States government. Spring 1945. The war in Europe is almost over. Allied forces are pushing deep into Nazi Germany from all sides, and as they advance through bombed-out cities and abandoned military bases, they start finding things. Things that shouldn't exist yet. The Nazis had been years ahead of the rest of the world in rocket technology, aviation, chemical weapons, aerospace medicine, and guided missile systems. The V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range ballistic missile, had been raining down on London and Antwerp for months. The technology was unlike anything the Allies had ever seen. And now, with Germany collapsing, the scientists who had built all of it were suddenly available. The United States and the Soviet Union both understood immediately what this meant. Whoever got to these scientists first would have an enormous military advantage in the years to come. So both superpowers did the same thing. They sent teams deep into German territory, sometimes ahead of their own front lines, to find the scientists, secure their research, and bring them back. For the Americans, this mission had a name: Operation Overcast. But when that name became too well known, when the press started asking questions, the operation was quietly renamed. They called it Operation Paperclip. The name came from paperclips attached to the files of scientists with the most problematic Nazi histories. The paperclip was a signal to investigators: don't look too closely at this one, he's one of ours now. Here's what Operation Paperclip actually involved, and why it was so deeply controversial. President Harry Truman had officially approved the program, but with one strict condition: no former Nazis, no active Nazi supporters, no one with war crimes on their record. The intelligence officials running the program ignored him completely. The Joint Intelligence Objective Agency, the JIOA, needed these scientists too badly to let something like war crimes get in the way, so they did something extraordinary. They falsified the records. Nazi party memberships were scrubbed from files, SS affiliations were deleted, references to concentration camp labor were removed, war crime investigations were quietly buried. And the scientists were given clean files, clean histories, clean starts in America. Over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians went through this process between 1945 and 1959. They were dispersed across military laboratories, universities, aerospace companies, and government agencies across the United States. Most of them disappeared quietly into American life. A few of them became famous. The most famous of all the paperclip recruits were Wernher von Braun. In Germany, he had been the technical director at Peenemünde, the top-secret military base where the V-2 rocket was developed. The V-2 was the most advanced weapon of its time. It was also built using slave labor from the Dora concentration camp. Prisoners, starving, worked to death, assembled rockets in underground tunnels. More people died building the V-2 than were killed by it in combat. Von Braun visited Dora. He selected workers. He knew exactly what was happening. His American file said none of this. His American file described him as a scientist who had been coerced into working for the Nazis, a reluctant participant, a man of science, not ideology. In reality, he had voluntarily joined the Nazi Party in 1937 and had been commissioned as an SS officer in 1940. None of that made it into his paperclip file. Instead, von Braun was brought to Fort Bliss in Texas, then Huntsville, Alabama. He became the director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center. He designed the Saturn V rocket that took Americans to the moon. He appeared on the cover of Time magazine. He was celebrated as an American hero. He died in 1977, never having faced any legal accountability for what happened at Dora. Von Braun was the most famous, but he was far from the most disturbing. Walter Schreiber was a Nazi doctor who had overseen medical experiments on concentration camp prisoners at Ravensbrück. Prisoners were deliberately infected with diseases, operated on without anesthesia, subjected to freezing temperatures to test survival limits. These were not fringe experiments. Schreiber supervised them. After the war, he testified at the Nuremberg doctors' trials. Then, instead of being prosecuted, he was quietly recruited by American intelligence. Brought to Texas, given a salary, put to work on biological warfare research for the U.S. Air Force. When a Boston newspaper finally exposed him in 1952, the public outcry was enormous. Schreiber was quietly helped to immigrate to Argentina by the U.S. military. He lived there freely until his death. Kurt Blom was the deputy Reich health leader and one of the Nazis' top biological weapons scientists. He had conducted plague experiments on prisoners at Auschwitz. He was actually tried at Nuremberg and somehow acquitted. 2 years later, the U.S. Army was paying him to research biological warfare at Camp King in West Germany. His expertise was too valuable to waste on justice. Arthur Rudolph was the operations director at the Dora underground factory where V-2 rockets were built. He had personally requested concentration camp labor to speed up production. He watched prisoners die building his rockets. His paperclip file described him as a 100% Nazi, dangerous type. He was recruited anyway. Rudolph went on to work for NASA and was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal, NASA's highest honor, for his work on the Saturn V rocket. It was only in 1984, when the Justice Department finally investigated his wartime record, that he agreed to give up his American citizenship and return to Germany to avoid persecution. He was never charged with any crime. Over and over again, the same pattern: war crimes, recruitment, silence, American careers, American rewards, American protection. Now here's where it gets complicated. Because the people who ran Operation Paperclip weren't monsters. They were making a calculation. The Soviet Union was doing exactly the same thing. Operation Osovyakim, the Soviet equivalent of Paperclip, forcibly relocated thousands of German scientists to Russia. The same scientists, the same technology, the same moral compromise. American officials genuinely believed, and they weren't wrong, that if they didn't recruit these people, Moscow would. And the Cold War was already beginning. Nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles, biological warfare programs. The stakes couldn't have been higher. And the results were undeniable. The paperclip scientists contributed directly to the U.S. space program, missile defense systems, jet engine development, and medical advances that saved American lives. The Saturn V rocket that landed men on the moon was built largely by men who had once built weapons for Adolf Hitler. So the question Operation Paperclip forces us to ask is genuinely uncomfortable. When the alternative is losing a technological arms race to the Soviet Union, how much moral compromise is acceptable? And who gets to decide? Here's where I land on this. I understand the strategic logic of Operation Paperclip. The Cold War was real. The Soviet threat was real. The arms race was real. I'm not naive enough to think foreign policy operates purely on moral principles. But I cannot accept that the answer to those pressures was to systematically destroy the war crime records of men who supervised the deaths of the concentration camp prisoners. That's not a strategic compromise. That's a cover-up, orchestrated by the United States government at the highest levels. The prisoners who died in those underground tunnels, building V-2 rockets, they deserve justice. They deserve Nuremberg trials and convictions and accountability. Instead, the men responsible for the deaths receive NASA medals and American citizenship. And the American public wasn't told any of this for decades. The files were classified, the records were sealed. The full truth only began to emerge in the 1980s when declassification finally started. What Operation Paperclip tells us, more than anything else, is that governments will always prioritize their own strategic interests over moral accountability. Not because the people running them are evil, but because when you're staring down an existential threat, it becomes very easy to convince yourself that the ends justify the means. And once you start destroying files and whitewashing histories, it's very hard to stop. The men who walked on the moon did so on the backs of people who never got justice. That's the truth of Operation Paperclip, and it deserves to be remembered. That's Operation Paperclip, a fully declassified, documented chapter of American history that most people were never taught in school. I want to know what you think about this one. Was Operation Paperclip a necessary evil or an unforgivable moral failure? Drop your take in the comments. I read all of them. If you're new to the obscured past, welcome. Every week we dig into the history that got buried, classified, or deliberately forgotten. Subscribe so you can never miss what we uncover next. Next time on the Obscured Past, we're going inside MKUltra, the CIA's top secret mind control program. Real subjects, real experiments, real cover-ups. In documents so disturbing that when Congress finally saw them, some members reportedly left the room. That story is coming very soon. Until then, stay curious and question everything.